The beeping of the hospital monitor was the only sound in the room besides my own shallow breathing. My newborn, barely hours old, lay inside the incubator, wires and tubes snaking around her tiny body. She was fighting, struggling for every fragile breath, and all I could do was press my palm against the glass and whisper, "Please stay with me." You would think that in a moment like this, family would rush to your side. But when I glanced around, the truth was deafening. There was no one there. Not my parents, not my siblings, not even a single cousin who had spent years bragging about how family comes first. I was alone, or at least that's how it felt in those early hours. My husband had gone to get a change of clothes, promising he'd be right back, but my parents, who lived only 20 minutes away, had decided they were too busy to come. My mother's exact words when I'd called were, "You chose this life. Don't expect us to clean up after your mistakes." Mistakes. That's what she called my daughter before she had even taken her first breath. I remember gripping the phone so tightly that my knuckles went white. I wanted to scream, to tell her that her granddaughter was fighting for her life, that this wasn't about choices or mistakes. This was about love. But my mother never understood love unless it came wrapped in money, status, or appearances. When I hung up, the silence felt heavier than the machines humming around me. Hours bled into days. The nurses were kind, offering small smiles, coffee, and gentle reassurances that babies were stronger than we gave them credit for. But each night, when visiting hours ended and the world outside dimmed, I sat alone beside my daughter, watching her chest rise and fall, praying that she would survive. And yet, somewhere deep down, I also prayed that maybe, just maybe, my family would surprise me. That one morning I'd open the door and find them waiting, flowers in hand, guilt written across their faces. That they'd finally see me, not as a disappointment or burden, but as a mother fighting for her child. That day never came. Instead, I overheard my sister's laughter during one of my rare phone calls home. She wasn't laughing about my daughter, but about the inheritance rumor that had started swirling since my grandfather's passing. "You know," she said carelessly, thinking I couldn't hear, "the sooner she breaks down completely, the easier it will be to divide what's left." Her words hit harder than any slap could. My baby was clinging to life, and all my sister cared about was carving up pieces of a fortune that wasn't even guaranteed. It was then that I realized the truth I'd been avoiding for years. My family didn't want me to succeed. They wanted me to vanish quietly, to stop reminding them of their own failures and cruelty. But life has a way of twisting even the darkest chapters into stories of strength. Because in the middle of all that despair, something inside me hardened. If my family wanted me gone, if they wanted to erase me, then I would give them a lesson they would never forget. And it started with one decision: to protect my daughter at any cost. Even if it meant protecting her from the very people who should have loved her most. The day I brought my baby home, the house felt quieter than ever before. I thought the silence would soothe her, but instead it seemed to echo the absence of family who should have been there. No grandmother to fuss over tiny socks, no aunties bringing casseroles, no proud uncles taking pictures. Just me, my husband, and the fragile miracle we'd carried home from the hospital. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. I repeated over and over, "She doesn't need them. She has me." But when the nights stretched long and the baby cried until my own tears blurred my vision, I felt the sharp edges of abandonment. Not because I couldn't survive without them, but because they had chosen not to survive with me. My husband tried. He really did. He worked long shifts, then came home to rock our daughter so I could sleep for an hour. He whispered encouragements when exhaustion made my hands tremble. But even he couldn't erase the sting of my mother's voice on the phone, dismissing my struggles as, "What happens when you live without family support?" Family support. The words curdled inside me. One night, after another call filled with subtle insults and false concern, I hung up and finally admitted what had been building inside my chest since the hospital. My family didn't want to be part of our lives. Not mine. Not my daughter's. Unless, of course, there was something in it for them. And that something was my grandfather's inheritance. When my grandfather passed, I had been too consumed with pregnancy complications to pay much attention to the whispers about his will. But now, months later, it seemed every conversation with my siblings circled back to the same question. Have you heard anything about what he left behind? They didn't ask about my baby. They didn't ask about me. They asked about money. It would have been laughable if it weren't so cruel. My grandfather had been a quiet man, a man who taught me to plant tomatoes in the backyard and never to speak more than necessary. He wasn't flashy, never bragged, but he had a way of watching people closely, as though weighing their souls. I remembered his hands, rough and scarred from years of carpentry, and the way he'd slip me a peppermint candy when my parents were too busy arguing. He had been the only one who ever made me feel seen. So when the lawyer's letter arrived, summoning the family for a formal reading of his will, I felt something shift inside me. The gathering was set for a Sunday afternoon in my parents' living room. My mother was already giddy, bragging about how her dutiful children would surely be rewarded. My sister polished her nails and joked about finally upgrading her car. My brother boasted about which vacation property he'd claim. And me? I stood quietly in the corner, rocking my daughter, who cooed softly in her blanket. They hardly glanced at her. It was almost funny how little they noticed me, how little they thought of me. When the lawyer began, the air changed. He spoke of my grandfather's modest beginnings, of how he had built his wealth carefully, quietly, never wasting but always planning. And then he spoke of his greatest disappointment. The way his family had treated one another, trading kindness for competition, love for greed. The room grew still. My mother shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. And then came the words that would unravel everything. The lawyer cleared his throat and continued reading from the papers in his hand. My client, your late father and grandfather, believed that wealth should not reward cruelty or neglect. He specifically instructed that the inheritance be given not to those who turned away from family in times of hardship, but to the one who stood strong despite abandonment. A heavy silence spread across the room. My sister's smirk faltered. My brother stopped tapping his foot. My mother sat straighter, her painted smile frozen in place. The lawyer read on. To my granddaughter, the one who carried new life into this world while enduring hardship alone, I leave the entirety of my estate. May it shield her and her child from the selfishness she has known and give her the freedom to live without fear. The words seemed to hang in the air, echoing louder with each second that passed. My mother's eyes snapped toward me, wide and disbelieving. My sister let out a sharp laugh, as if it were all some cruel joke. My brother muttered under his breath, his fists clenched tight. I tightened my hold on my daughter, feeling her tiny heartbeat against my chest. For the first time in months I felt seen, protected, vindicated. The lawyer began listing the details, properties, accounts, even small personal belongings that my grandfather had chosen specifically for me. A watch he wore every day, his tool set, a box of letters he had kept hidden in his desk. Things no one else in the family even knew existed. My mother's voice finally broke the silence. This must be a mistake, she sputtered. My father would never. The lawyer cut her off firmly. These are his signed instructions. Verified. Sealed. There is no mistake. The fury in the room boiled over. My sister slammed her hands on the table, demanding fairness. My brother threatened legal action. My mother accused me of manipulation. But their protests were useless. The more they raged, the calmer I felt. My grandfather had known them. He had seen their greed, their coldness, their absence in my darkest hours, and he had chosen accordingly. As they shouted, my baby stirred, opening her eyes for a brief moment. She looked up at me with an innocence untouched by the chaos around us. And I realized something powerful. This wasn't just about money. This was about legacy. My grandfather had given me not just security, but proof that kindness and perseverance mattered more than cruelty and neglect. When the lawyer finally packed his papers and left, the living room was in shambles. My mother refused to look at me. My sister stormed out, her heels clattering against the floor. My brother muttered curses as he followed behind. I stood there, rocking my daughter, surrounded by the very family who had turned their backs on me. And yet, for the first time, I felt no need for their approval. Their rejection no longer had the power to wound me, because now, I held not just my daughter in my arms, but the weight of my grandfather's trust, his love, and his belief that I was strong enough to carry on. And as I stepped out of that house, the cool air brushing against my face, I whispered to my daughter, "We don't need them. We never did. And now they finally know it too." The days after the will reading were a blur of chaos for my family. But for me, they were strangely calm. While my mother and siblings scrambled to contact lawyers, each convinced they could overturn my grandfather's decision, I settled into a quiet rhythm with my daughter. Every smile she gave me felt like proof that I had chosen the right battles and let go of the wrong ones. But the storm wasn't done. One evening, I received an unexpected visit. My sister stood on my doorstep, her face twisted with anger and desperation. "You don't deserve any of it," she hissed the moment I opened the door. "You got lucky because you played the victim. Dad was sick when he made that will. He wasn't thinking clearly." Her words might have stung once, but now they just slid off me like rain. I asked her to leave, but before turning away, she spat, "You'll regret this. Money doesn't buy love. You'll always be alone." When the door closed, I leaned against it, my baby stirring in her crib. My sister's bitterness was proof of exactly why my grandfather had made his choice. Love, to her, was conditional, and family was just another competition. Weeks passed. Letters arrived, threatening lawsuits. My mother called once, her tone dripping with false sweetness, pretending she suddenly cared about me and my daughter. When I refused to meet her demands, her mask slipped instantly, and she cursed me with words I'll never forget. But here's the truth. None of it mattered anymore. Because with every passing day, my daughter grew stronger. Her tiny hands gripped mine with surprising strength. Her laugh filled the small apartment we now lived in, an apartment paid for by my grandfather's final gift. One morning, as I held her on the balcony, sunlight touching her face, I realized what my grandfather had truly left me. Freedom. Not just financial freedom, but freedom from the need to beg for love where it was never given. Still, the inheritance had created waves in ways I hadn't expected. Relatives I barely knew came knocking, hoping to reconnect. Old family friends suddenly remembered my name. Everyone wanted a piece of the story, a share of what they thought was theirs by right. And yet, amid all the noise, I stayed grounded. I remembered the nights in the hospital when no one came, the tears I cried alone when I thought I would lose my baby, the silence of my phone when I begged for help. Those memories anchored me, reminding me that I didn't owe anyone explanations, apologies, or pieces of myself just to keep the peace. Instead, I owed something greater to my daughter. I owed her a life where love wasn't conditional, where she never had to question her worth, where family meant protection and not betrayal. My grandfather's inheritance wasn't just money. It was a seed I could plant to build a safe, nurturing world for her. Months later, the legal threats fizzled. My family realized the will was airtight. They stopped calling, stopped writing, stopped trying to claw back what was never theirs. Silence replaced the chaos. And in that silence, I found peace. Because sometimes, the greatest revenge is not shouting back or proving them wrong. It's thriving so brightly that their darkness can't touch you anymore. Time has a way of softening the sharpest wounds, but some scars never fully fade. Mine weren't just emotional. They were lessons carved deep into my soul. As the seasons changed, so did I. I was no longer the daughter who begged for acceptance, or the sister desperate to belong. I had stepped into something stronger, not because of wealth, but because I finally understood the power of choosing myself. One afternoon, while organizing some papers, I stumbled across a sealed envelope tucked into the back of my grandfather's leather-bound journal. My hands trembled as I opened it, the familiar scrawl of his handwriting dancing across the page. "My dearest granddaughter," it began. "If you are reading this, then you already know the truth. You were always my choice, not for the inheritance, but for the legacy. I saw the strength in you long before you did. The others, They may one day regret how they treated you, but you must never carry their burden. Carry only the love you give to your child, for in her eyes, you will find the family you always longed for. That is my true gift to you. Tears blurred the ink as I read those words over and over. In that moment, I realized the inheritance wasn't just money or property. It was a declaration that someone had seen me, believed in me, even when the people closest to me had turned their backs. With renewed purpose, I began building a future not just for survival, but for growth. I enrolled in courses I'd once thought were out of reach. I invested in small projects that gave me pride. And slowly, the weight of the past shifted into something lighter, a foundation instead of a chain. My daughter grew alongside this new life. Her first steps were taken on polished wooden floors my grandfather's gift had paid for. Her first words echoed through a home filled with warmth, not judgment. Every milestone was a reminder that the pain I had endured had transformed into something beautiful. Occasionally, I'd hear whispers of my family. A cousin would mention that my mother was still bitter, my siblings still resentful. But those whispers no longer had power over me. They were echoes of a life I had left behind. Then, one day, fate gave me an unexpected encounter. At a local market, I saw my sister. Her once carefully composed face now carried the heavy lines of bitterness. She looked at me, then at my daughter holding my hand. For a brief second, her eyes softened, as though she might speak. But instead, she turned away. I felt no anger, no triumph, only clarity. The inheritance had not divided us, their choices had. And my choice had been to rise above. As I tucked my daughter into bed that night, her tiny voice whispered, "I love you, Mama." Those words held more value than any sum of money, more weight than any inheritance. Because they weren't given out of duty or expectation. They were pure, unconditional, and real. And that was when it struck me. My grandfather had orchestrated more than justice. He had given me the chance to rewrite what family meant. So here is my truth. I lost a family that never truly saw me, but I gained a future where my child will never doubt her place in my heart. The inheritance was never about wealth. It was about dignity, freedom, and the strength to stand tall even when the world tried to make me small. And in the silence left behind by those who abandoned us, my daughter's laughter fills the air. That sound, bright, unbroken, unstoppable, is the only legacy I'll ever need.